All right, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. My name is Dr. Rebecca Mears. I'm a member of the VIN Foundation Student Debt Education Team. Sharing a little bit of housekeeping information before we get started, in addition to our wonderful Dr. Tony Bartels, who's going to be sharing a ton of really helpful information. We're also joined by Jordan Benchia and Taylor Oliver in the background. The three of us will kind of be keeping up with tech issues, questions, things like that throughout the presentation. We do ask that you try to keep the chat for any like technical issues, or if Tony asks a question and to respond to him there in the chat. If you have questions for Tony throughout the presentation, use the Q&A, which you can find down at the bottom of your screen for that. In the Q&A, you can ask questions anonymously, and you can also upvote questions. By upvoting, we know that that's a question that a lot of people are concerned about, and that helps us to go ahead and prioritize those questions. We'll be answering some things throughout the presentation, as well as doing a bunch of live Q&A after the presentation towards the end of things as well. We will be recording this. That recording, Tony's Prezi, other helpful information will all be sent out in a follow-up email that usually comes out in the next couple of days, just so we can collect all of those resources and get them together. And then we'll be sending that out to you. Look for that to come from studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. And so, like I said, we'll have that out in the next couple of days. So with that, I know that there are a ton of concerns. I know that there's some high anxiety about everything that's going on. And so I don't want to take up too much time with anything else. I'm just going to turn it over to Tony so we can start diving into this information and hopefully settle some of those concerns and anxieties.
Oh, sounds good. Thanks, Becca. So I see too, I just opened up the Q&A panel. Hi, Chris. Starting it off strong there. What are we going to do if studentaid.gov is shut down? Yeah, I mean, that's, it's kind of where we're at. We'll talk about that, right? I mean, thankfully right now it's not shut down, but we're going to keep accessing it as, as long as it is available, right? We're going to talk about things that you can and should be doing to protect yourself in the event that you do lose access to some of this data that we currently have access to, right? I mean, that's where we really are, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions because there is a lot of uncertainty and we don't exactly know what's going to happen next. But we can't talk about what we currently do know, and again, what you can do in order to protect yourself, to make sure you have good records of everything that's going on with your student loans. Looking at them a little bit more critically than potentially you have in the past, to start thinking about where you might want to go with your student loans if you're using Save and it doesn't survive, or as part of the litigation that's tying up Save, we also have forgiveness for some of the other income-driven plans in question, right? So if you're using one of those plans and all of a sudden it turns out you're not able to receive forgiveness under one of those plans, you're going to maybe look for somewhere else to go next, right? So those are the types of things that we have to start thinking about, right? So I was kind of, all week I've been trying to decide how to talk about this best, right? I mean, I've been in repayment now for 12, 13 years with my student loans and anticipating reaching forgiveness. I'm still anticipating reaching forgiveness, but up until this point, pretty much all of the options have only gotten better and more expansive and not worse and more limiting, right? So we may see a shift in that. It doesn't mean I'm going to completely bail on it altogether yet, right? We don't have any indication that all of it is gone, right? It isn't gone yet. All of it's still written down and should still be executed largely as written. But we also have a new Congress, a new administration. They have full control and they can change the laws, right? So those are things that we have to look out for. So that's, setting the stage. I did bring my my ski helmet after reading all of your guys's questions and the submissions you had ahead of time. Felt like I needed to have some protection, but I'm sure we'll get to some of those harder questions later. But we do have to take care of, just setting the stage. What do we know? What should we be doing? And we also have some new tools that we want to introduce tonight that will hopefully help you gather some of that data. So let's dive in and see, what we can learn, and then also what we can learn from you in terms of your questions and where you should be heading with your student loans, or how you might change how you're thinking about them. So we're going to talk about where things stand currently with the income-driven repayment plans. We did see the reopening of Pay As You Earn and the income contingent repayment plan. As the previous administration was walking out the door, they were able to reactivate Pay As You Earn and ICR. So if you weren't aware, as part of creating the SAVE plan, they were going to phase out Pay As You Earn and ICR, and they actually did phase those plans out in July of 2024. But with all the litigation and what turned repayment into a mess and really constrained the forgiveness options that most people had, they reopened Pay As You Earn and ICR. So you did have, or some people do have, additional options to make forgiveness qualifying payments. Unfortunately, you can't receive forgiveness using Pay As You Earn or ICR. That's part of some of the litigation that's tying up SAVE, as well as what are called the Department of Ed created income-driven repayment plans. SAVE, Pay As You Earn, and ICR are in that category. So you can earn forgiveness credit, you just can't be granted forgiveness while you're currently using one of those plans, not until the court actually makes a determination on that litigation that's pending. So a lot of questions, in addition to, what's going to happen to income-driven repayment and what's going to happen to public service loan forgiveness is, should I switch? And if so, when and what would you switch to, right? So those are things we'll also talk about tonight. Just to give you a little bit of idea of what that could be. We also have recertification happening again. It's been years since that has been a thing. Right, we had our for those of you that have been in repayment long enough, your loans were in the pandemic forbearance benefit period. You didn't have to make any payments. You didn't have to recertify your income. They kept kicking that can down the road, and we're finally to the point where regular income-driven repayment recertifications are starting to be due. Right, so if you're using a plan like IBR or Pay As You Earn or ICR, you may have to, if you haven't already, provide updated income information. If you're using SAVE, you don't have to, at least not yet. But the other income-driven plans do require you to recertify, and we're also in tax filing season, right? And with these income-driven plans, as the name implies, the payments are a function of your income. They determine your income a lot of times from the numbers on your tax returns. So how you file your tax returns, when you filed your most recent one, how your income has changed, how your family circumstances have changed, will all play a role in, whether or not you should switch, how you should think about recertification, and, ultimately, what is your monthly payment going to be going forward. Your forgiveness payment count details, that was a huge one, right? So for years, we've been talking about the one-time forgiveness count adjustment, and it's here. Right, everybody has some data applied now somehow, right? And we're going to talk about how you can access that. There's a couple of different ways you can see that payment count data depending on the plan that you're using. We're going to want to know what the Department of Education has on file for us for forgiveness payment counts, because that'll also play into the decision as to whether or not you should continue marching towards forgiveness or potentially switch gears to something else. And that's, where all the we're going to kind of lead into tough topics, your questions, curiosities that you might be having to finish up this session. But ultimately, hopefully, we'll be able to tame some of this anxiety that obviously is present just based on the submissions to the registration and your primary student loan repayment concerns. And understandably so, right? This is some pretty radical change period we've been in. I mean, really ever since the pandemic, when it comes to student loans, things seem to be changing monthly, weekly, daily, right, on the student loan front. So a lot of things to work through here. So here's some of the ones I pulled out that I thought were, kind of captured some of that. Obviously, the election kind of changed everything, and it was going to change regardless, right? No matter who won that election, there were going to be changes to student loan repayment. just based on the litigation and all of the different repayment options that and changes that we saw from the previous administration. But now, with that administration on the out and a new administration coming in, who has a whole different idea of student loan repayment, we could see a significant series of changes in a different direction. So one of the ones that some of these comments catch my attention, right? So, increasing in rate yet again, making monthly payments unaffordable. When I read something like that, there's a lot to untangle in there, right? So when I see rate, I automatically think of interest rate, right? But I'm guessing that this person means their monthly payment rate. But when we talk about student loans, particularly U.S. federal student loans, the overwhelming majority of you have fixed interest rate loans, right? Which means the interest rates don't change. Variable rate loans were a thing way back when, but if you've consolidated your loans at any point along the way, and there's been a lot of reason for a lot of people to do so over the years, then you're most likely going to have a fixed rate interest rate on your student loans. If you have private loans, you might have a variable interest rate, but interest rates on student loans are fixed. If your monthly payment is increasing, that means one of two things, right? It means your income is increasing, which in case that's the case, congratulations. Or you're using a graduated repayment plan where the payment increases every 2 years automatically, whether your income increases or not. Graduated repayment plans, were a helpful tool before there was income-driven repayment plans, but there's not great reasons to be using graduated repayment plans anymore. Right. So if we take that off the table, hopefully that person's not using a graduated repayment plan. Then if their payment rate is increasing, it's because their income is increasing. And that's how income-driven repayment plans work. And I do think I point that out because I do think we've had payments shut off for so long that a lot of people forgot how student loan repayment worked, or the people who graduated during the pandemic period didn't really have an understanding of how their loans would behave in repayment, right? And we're kind of getting used to that or introduced to that all over again in the midst of all these changes, right? So it's certainly a lot going on. I'm currently on a save forbearance. What plan should I consider next? Yeah, that's the big one, right? In addition to a lot of anxiety and questions I saw around public service loan forgiveness, that's probably the next biggest area of confusion is what do I do with this save forbearance, right? So anybody that's been using save, your loans have automatically been placed into a interest-free, payment-free forbearance period, which is great. But the not so great thing is you're not earning any forgiveness credit during that period. And that started in July when the court blocked the save repayment plan. And it will persist probably mostly through 2025. So unless we see a court ruling sooner or some other change sooner that forces that to end sooner than that. So what should you do while you're in that forbearance period? What should you switch to? Well, the answers to those are going to depend on what options you have available and what your circumstances are. This is one that is really frustrating, right? And and this comes in a variety of flavors. With the one-time forgiveness count adjustment, more people than ever are closer than ever to reaching student loan forgiveness, right? We saw actually millions of borrowers receive student loan forgiveness during the last administration because of the one-time count adjustment. But those that didn't quite cross the finish line and received a payment count adjustment are now looking at a number that shows them they're very, very close to receiving forgiveness. And in this case, this person's 5 payments, right? So 5 monthly qualifying payments from reaching the forgiveness threshold, right? But it's very difficult to get your loans across the finish line now, just given the nature of the election and the changes in administration, as well as the court litigation around SAVE and pausing forgiveness on some of the Department of Ed created plans. So accruing and capitalizing interest with MOHELA, right? So MOHELA is one of the loan servicers. Loan servicers are largely irrelevant except when they're causing issues, right? Which they all do, mostly because they provide some terrible information. But your loans don't behave any differently because of with MOHELA than any other loan servicer. They can be accruing interest, right? Unless you're in the save forbearance, they shouldn't be capitalizing, right? So we'll talk about that common misconception with student loans, as well as compounding, right? The interest on your student loans do not compound, which is one of the benefits of your federal student loans compared to other loans, and should have never switched. I'm not really sure which. I think we're probably talking about consolidating and using save, maybe, but you can also go back to paying the same payment you were paying before, right? If you really want to. So a lot to unpack, and you can certainly tell there's a lot of anxiety around student loans repayment and just how to get questions answered. So what do I see? Uncertainty, right? We just don't have enough information to really go on yet to make concrete repayment decisions, and that sucks. What we're probably going to see is more terrible service from the servicers. At least in the last administration, they were getting some guidance, although it changed frequently because they were changing the rules a lot, and we had a lot of changes with the court cases and things. Now they're going to get a whole different directive, and or they're not going to get any directive at all, and which is going to lead to just more terrible information provided from them. So it just puts more on you to know more about what is going on with your student loans, right? That has never been more important. You just cannot set it and forget it, right? You cannot not pay attention to your student loans right now. There's just too much going on, and the mistakes can be too costly if something is happening that you're not aware of. And I talked about this, but the forgiveness count adjustment has brought more people closer to student loan forgiveness than ever. But how can you get across the finish line, right? Can you, and how, right? Those are the two questions that are going to be something that we focus on. Some of you are very close, right? Like the example that I gave are months away, maybe less than 5 years away. Some are about 5 to 10 years away, and some are more than 10 years away, right? So what should you do, right? And a lot of what you should do depends on where you fall in this grouping. But other factors that will determine that is your student debt to income ratio, the plans that you're eligible to use, and your overall, kind of family financial picture, and how you think that's going to change in the short term and the long term. All right, so let's dive into the student loan physical exam, right? So these are, again, this is going to be more critical than ever, right? I mean, the federal student loans, we need to understand what we're dealing with. And thankfully, a lot of you have already been through this just from the one-time count adjustment, right? So there was a lot of, hey, I need to really look critically at my student loans to understand whether or not I need to consolidate or how I'm going to maximize my forgiveness payment count adjustment. But for those of you that didn't have to deal with that, or are relatively new to repayment, knowing the differences among your federal student loans and the repayment options that you're eligible for is critical in helping to alleviate some of this uncertainty. Right, so federal student loans come in a variety of flavors. Most of you are probably walking around with direct unsubsidized or direct grad plus loans. If you have loans from undergrad, you'll have direct subsidized loans. If you are in higher education prior to July 1st of 2010, then you might have these federal family education loans in your portfolio. These are the precursors to the direct loan family of student loans, right? These are a little bit less beneficial, right? Not eligible for a lot of the newer income-driven repayment options or repayment benefits. You may also have some Perkins loans floating around. Those were discontinued in 2018. I still see health profession student loans and to a lesser extent, loans for disadvantaged students. These are all types of federal student loans that can be consolidated and then made to be eligible for or participate in something like an income-driven repayment strategy or be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So the first step is, identifying these types of loans that you might have. I'm going to say it a lot tonight, and it may not feel like it particularly right now, but your federal student loans are the most flexible, definitely most annoying debt you'll ever have. Right. So what we're trying to do is minimize the annoying parts, right? Minimize the anxiety around them and maximize the flexibility. Right. And there still is a lot of flexibility in your federal student loans. Private loans are a whole different beast, right? There's several questions peppered in the registration. submissions about what do I do with private loans. I've seen some people on the student debt message boards talk about private loans that have, 14 to 16% interest rates. Then I've heard some other people talking about private loans they have that don't accrue interest at all. Right. So for the most part, private loans are much less flexible than your federal student loans. They won't be as uncertain. Right. The terms of those private loans are pretty well defined, usually by the interest rate and the term that you agree to pay those back. That usually establishes the minimum monthly payment. The bad news is there's not much you can do about it. Right. They are what they are. Right. Now you might be able to refinance them, provided you could get a better deal on them. But that can be difficult as well, right? Depending on where you are and what your credit score is and things like that. Generally speaking, we don't recommend refinancing federal student loans into a private loan because, again, these federal student loans have a lot of flexibility baked into them, a lot of protections baked into them, even as uncertain as it all is right now. They are more flexible than private loans. Right. So you have to be very careful because once you convert a federal student loan into a private loan, there's no going back. And then there is no way to get a private loan into a federal repayment plan or into the federal student loan repayment benefits. If you've lost track of anything, and particularly now, this is going to be a great opportunity to check your credit report. You can check that pretty frequently. I still think they're allowing you to check that for free. It used to be you can only check it for free once a year, but then during the pandemic, they made that pretty much, whenever you wanted to check it. And I think they were at monthly for a while. I think they're still allowing you some pretty frequent checks on a free basis to see your credit report. And that's where you'll maybe find some things that you've lost track of, or you can find other shenanigans going on. If somebody has gotten your information and opened an account in your name, you'll see things like that on there. If you have outstanding balances or delinquent balances, you'll see those in your credit report too. So that's a good place to check, particularly with all of the student loan repayment uncertainty. Sometimes it looked like we had payments due, sometimes not, and it was confusing whether or not you needed to make payments. And you want to see if anything there has been reported, or if you had missed out too long on a certain repayment due. For a while, they weren't even reporting any kind of defaults or late payments for things like federal student loans to credit reporting agencies, but I believe that has been lifted since. So you'll want to keep a closer eye on that just to make sure you haven't lost track of anything. And this is really, when we talk about what are we going to do next, right? This is where we have to really critically analyze our budgets. Right? So what the income-driven plans do really well is provide a reasonable monthly payment compared to your income. Right? And we talk about, okay, there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't really want to deal with it. I just want to be done with my student loans. Well, that introduces a whole new series of variables that we have to consider, right? What will that do to my monthly payment, right? And will your budget allow it, right? In many cases, depending on what our student loan balances are or what our financial circumstances are, we may not be able to absorb a different income-driven repayment plan or a non-income driven repayment strategy, right? So, I get everybody's desire to make student loans go away as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. We have to consider what does that look like, right? And how will that work in my budget? And ideally, we don't want to be sacrificing other critical areas of our overall financial wellness to make our student loans go away faster. Right. So that's really where we kind of run up against some of the more challenging aspects of student loan repayment. Sure, we can wave a magic wand and everybody can have a affordable monthly payment and not have it impact their overall budget and pay their balances zero in a reasonable amount of time. We wouldn't really have an issue, right? But that's unfortunately not the world that we currently live in with student loans. So how do we do this student loan physical exam? We're going to check our student aid data file, right? So, and this is going to give me an opportunity to pop over to studentaid.gov. And there's a lot of changes in here. And this kind of leads me to Chris's first question about what do we do if studentaid.gov is no longer available. As you can see here, it still currently is available, right? So you want to be able to get in here while it is still available, right? I did read some reports this week that Department of Education has hit the radar of this new administration, in particular, Elon's new Department of Government Efficiency. So we may start seeing some changes here. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So far, they're, looks like they're just kind of asking people to leave if they're not canning them all together, which is going to just make supporting things like student loans a little bit more difficult. But we can clearly see that the website is still available, which is great. So I'm going to log in here. Just I can see too while I'm waiting for my text message that the education staffers are being offered buyouts currently, right? So in line with what we were just talking about. All right, so here's my code. Oh. Let's see. Again. Code again. There we go. So this one work. All right. Lots of scary language. Okay, so in here, and some of you, this might be a review, but there's some newer information here that you're going to want to check to see if you can see, because it's going to be on the list of things that we check. So here's your student aid dashboard, right? And if you've been here before with me, you'll know that I typically go to this view details button, which then takes me to the option to allow me to download my student aid data file. But before I do that, I want to show you what you might be able to access as well. And this gets to the question about how do I access my forgiveness count data, right? So for some of you, most of you that are using an income-driven plan, you'll see this IDR end of payment term, right? So this is what compiles all of the forgiveness count data that were applied to your loans and says what the count is and how much time you have remaining. Right, so I have about 13 years left until I reach forgiveness because I'm using a plan that requires 25 years until I hit forgiveness. So that is a result of that forgiveness payment count adjustment. And I can see that because my loans were in the save plan before the court blocked it. If you're using another income-driven repayment plan, you should be able to see this, right? But if you're not using an income-driven plan or you weren't able to get your loans officially into that save plan before the courts blocked it, you may not see this widget. All right, so log into studentaid.gov, open a different browser tab while you're listening here, and see if you can see your IDR end of payment term data. Right, I'll come back to this later, right? I just want, this is how you'll know if you can see it. It'll be right on your dashboard. One of the other things that I think is really important while we're in here is this My Activity, right? This is relatively new, right? So when you submit an income-driven repayment application or you submit your recertification or you consolidate your loans, whatever you do, you should see a record of that in your activity. And it also will show you a status, right? Either in process or in this case, you can see completed. That was the last time I had to provide some income-driven repayment information is when my loan switched from Repay to Save. I had some complications when they automatically did that switch, which required me to provide some additional income information. So that's what My Activity will check or track there as well. I'm going to click on the View Details button here. And it's going to take me to that next page. And this is the page that has the download my aid data. All right, so this is kind of our, minimum database, right? To do our good student loan physical exam. I'm going to click this button, some more scary language. It's going to want to download it as a text file, right? And I'm going to download this My Student Data text file, save it to my device. And that's the file that I then go over to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool and upload that data. That text file, I've gotten this question a number of times since we've been talking about the payment count data. Unfortunately, the payment count data is not in your student aid data file. I wish it would be, and I hope someday it will be, but it currently is not. Right? If you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, you will see public service loan forgiveness count data in your student aid data file. But the income-driven repayment counts, the same count that I showed you on my dashboard, that data does not currently live in your file, but it is available through that widget. If you have that widget available, it's also available through a different API that we'll show you in just a few minutes. All right, so once you have that student aid data file, we're going to upload that to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. So this is one of the freely available resources in the VIN Foundation, on the VIN Foundation website. Publicly available, anybody can use this, everybody does use this, but it's designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students. That said, anybody who has graduate school student loans, i.e. veterinarians, can use this. All of the algorithms, all of the repayment calculations, and all of the determinations on what plans you're eligible for are based on borrowers who have graduate school student loans. Right, so veterinarians fall into that category. If you are attending this and you happen to have only undergraduate student loans, or you are, somebody that helps other folks make sense of their repayment and they only have undergraduate student loans, you have to be a little bit careful here, right? So we don't model those scenarios, and there are some differences for folks who have only undergraduate loans versus those who have graduate school student loans. This webinar is geared towards people who are in repayment, right? So you have three choices here. This is largely for folks who haven't started graduate school yet, or pre-veterinary students. This is for veterinary students who are still borrowing. And this option here is for veterinarians who are in repayment, or those folks who have graduated from graduate school. So I'm going to upload a sample here. I've got quite a few that we can run through for this session this evening. So let's look at this one here. So this is a text file from somebody who has reached out to VIN Foundation for personalized assistance recently, and is a 2017 DVM. They're in income-driven repayment profile 2. I'll show you what that means in a second. They're using the pay-as-you-earn income-driven repayment plan. Their current student debt to income ratio is greater than 2. Right? So we take their student debt number, in this case, $359,000, divided by their income, we get a number, and in this case, that number is greater than 2. So we can see in this representation, we've got 2 loans remaining, serviced by Nelnet. This is, these 2 loans are most likely, I can look here in the types, but I know just from this view that they're consolidated loans, direct unsubsidized and a direct subsidized component. They both have the same fixed interest rate. They're using the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan. They have a minimum monthly payment of $423 per month, and their anniversary date is actually 2 weeks away. Right. So hopefully this person has submitted their income-driven documentation, their annual recertification data, because they're already too late if they haven't. Right. So this is another one of those things that you're going to want to check and keep an eye on closely. If you're using an income-driven plan, the anniversary date is kind of, you can think of it as the expiration date for your income-driven repayment plan. Right. So after this date, a new monthly payment schedule will be generated. And if they don't have your income information on hand, then it will revert to something that looks like a standard 10-year plan payment. In this case, that'll be close to, $3,700 per month, right? So quite a large change. So you want to make sure that you get your income information in 35 days before the anniversary date that's listed for your income-driven plan. Right. So if you upload that file, we'll show you that information here. And if you're within that time frame, we'll have some reminders in there to kind of poke you on, getting that income information submitted as soon as you can. Right, the drop dead deadline is 10 days before, right? So, but the loan servicers have come out and said the last couple of years, if you don't get it in within 35 days of your anniversary date, there's a really good chance we're not going to get it processed in time. So, if they hadn't submitted it by now, this would be, get it in as soon as you can, but chances are, you may have to request a deferment or forbearance, so you don't trigger that, in this case, $3,700 a month payment that it would revert to because you didn't get the income information into them on time. All right, so I say that this person has an income-driven repayment profile of 2. What does that mean? So the income-driven repayment plans have special qualification requirements, largely based on when they were created and also based on the types of loans that were available at that time frame. So for the most part, there are 4 major ones. There's also income contingent repayment. We're working on adding that into this income-driven repayment eligibility view, but we currently don't show that. Up until recently, income contingent repayment, that was the oldest of all of the IDR plans, really didn't have a whole lot of utility, right? But the one-time forgiveness account adjustment, it does, right? And we can talk a little bit more about that later, which is why we're going to add that into the income-driven repayment eligibility view. But this particular person is eligible for the old version of IBR, pay as you earn, which we have to update this text as well, so that pay as you earn is reopened. Saving on a valuable education, which you still can apply for, right? You just can't get a monthly payment generated for it. And then the new version of IBR, which this person is not eligible for, right? So this constellation of income-driven repayment eligibility equates to what I call IDR Profile 2. Right, and that's helpful because if for some reason you're not able to continue using Pay, the plan that they're currently using, and Save goes away because the court says we can't do this anymore, then they're left with the old version of IBR, and ICR, right? So that's how you can start thinking about, well, what's potentially next, right? Now that's not ideal, right? IBR 2009 is not the greatest of income-driven plans. It's certainly better than income contingent repayment, but it's not nearly as good as Pay as you earn, not nearly as good as Save, not nearly as good as the new version of IBR, right? But by knowing that information, at least gives me some idea of where I could end up if I do end up switching, and income-driven repayment is going to work best for me. And in this case, with a debt-to-income ratio greater than 2, right, it's going to be quite difficult for this person to use a repayment option other than an income-driven repayment plan, even if it does have to be IBR, right? But it doesn't have to be IBR right now. It's just kind of, I've got a pin in that to say, maybe I'm going to end up here if a worst case scenario pans out. Right now, for those of you that upload your file and you see that you're eligible for IBR 2014, that puts you in a little bit better position. Right, and that IBR 2014 is very similar to Pay as you earn. So if you were to lose access to Pay as you earn, at least from a forgiveness standpoint, you could use the new version of IBR. Payments would be the same. The time to forgiveness would be the same. Right, so it's pretty much a lateral move, right, from Pay as you earn to IBR. Right, if you're eligible for that new version. These are mutually exclusive. Right, you're either eligible for the old version or the new version. Right, and if you upload your student aid data file, you can see which one of those profiles that you fall into. So that's kind of what we're looking at, particularly now, right? We want to see, what is my balance? What are my interest rates? What repayment plans am I using? Am I eligible for? What is my minimum monthly payment? What is my anniversary date? Right, what are my other options in case I need them? All right, so where are we right now? So Save is blocked since July of 2024. There's no interest, no payments. Forgiveness credit is not being granted. Right, so since July, if you've been monitoring your payment counter, you'll notice that your payment count hasn't changed. Right. So it essentially pushes forgiveness into the future. Right. But it's not costing you anything. Right. And that's where, that's where my loans are currently. And I'm not, that's not a bad place to be. Right. To have your payments, to have a, student loan that doesn't cost you anything. Right. Maybe it pushes my forgiveness a little bit farther down the road. Right. But presuming I can still get there, it's okay because it hasn't changed my balance at all. Right. So I know there's been a lot of, anxiety around how do I get back into getting forgiveness credit? And that's cool, right? But you don't necessarily want to trade a zero payment, zero interest scenario for a payment greater than zero and potentially seeing your interest accrue again, just so you can get forgiveness credit. Right. So those are some of the things that you have to consider when we're thinking about switching, particularly if you are in that save forbearance. If you're not, you can still apply for it. Right. You can actually still apply for save. It's a complicated process. It takes at least 2 months. Right. So there's a 2-month processing forbearance where you won't have a payment due, but you will see your interest accrue and you do still get forgiveness credit. And after that 2 months, you can request the general forbearance, which means the interest stops, the payment stops, but so does the forgiveness credit. Right. And another thing that the prior administration did on their way out the door was lay out kind of a transition path for getting people back into repayment who are using save, provided there isn't, some court ruling between now and then. And what they said is that we're going to have a way for the loan servicers to calculate a monthly payment using save starting potentially in September of 2025, which means payments would then start being due again in December of 2025. Right. So that kind of gives us a idea maybe of how long the save forbearance could last. Right. But the outgoing administration really doesn't get to make the future rules. So we could see something change between now and then that would put that on a different schedule. But if for some reason nothing changes between now and the end of the year, that is kind of the process that's laid out for those folks that are in the save forbearance. They've also kicked the recertifications for anybody that are using save into 2026. So the earliest that could happen would be February of 2026. Pay and ICR reopened to do enrollees, and it will essentially what they did is extend the phase out date, right? So they phased it out in July of 2024, as they planned to do when they created save. Because of the save litigation and the lack of access to a forgiveness eligible plan, they reopened Pay as you earn and ICR, and they put an expiration date on that, or at least kicked that expiration date down the road to July 1st of 2027. Right, so it gives you more options to earn forgiveness credit, right? But the litigation that stopped save also called into question the ability of the Department of Ed to create a forgiveness plan like ICR, like Pay as you earn, like Repay, which then turned into save, right? So depending on how they rule on that part of the litigation will determine whether or not you're able to receive forgiveness under one of these so-called Department of Ed created plans. So forgiveness is not impacted for the IBR plans. The IBR plans were created under separate legislation by Congress that more explicitly defined income, the income-driven repayment terms, including forgiveness, right? So those are largely viewed to be safe, right? It would literally take a new act of Congress to change those current plans, right? And there really hasn't been any indication that they're going to go back and change those plans for folks that are currently eligible for them. right? A lot of the drafts that are out there now are talking about what repayment would look like for, folks who haven't entered repayment yet. Right, so we kind of have that fallback plan, if you will, of the IBR plans. The Department of Ed created plans are more beneficial, more flexible than the IBR plans, but the IBR plans are better than no forgiveness plans, right? So we kind of have that safety net currently, again, pending any changes by the new Congress, new administration. Since they do control pretty much all of the levers of government, they could choose to change those laws, right? But it would be pretty unlikely that they do that. All right. The IDR applications, recalculations, recertifications have resumed. We have seen the poverty rate guidelines updated for 2025, right? So they, as part of the calculation they use to calculate your minimum monthly payment under an income-driven plan, they use these poverty rate guidelines. And these poverty rate guidelines generally change each year based on how inflation changes, right? And because inflation's been, persistently high, they got adjusted higher than they were last year, which means payments will be lower using income-driven plans, given the same income and family information from a previous year, right? So we want to use that data when we're calculating our estimates for our monthly payments. When you submit to have your income driven repayment plan recertified, like in the case of the example I showed, the person who's recertifying pay-as-you-earn, we want to do that math check, right? Because this is one of those things that the loan servicers routinely screw up, right? So we want to make sure that based on the income information we submit, what our family size is, what our recent tax filing status is, that we calculate a payment, and that's the payment that we ultimately end up seeing our loan servicer applying on our statements, right? And if we don't, if it's higher, we want to definitely reach out to them and make sure that they're calculating that correctly. You don't have to wait until your anniversary date to recertify your income if your income has decreased, right? So if you have a period of low income, if you took family leave, maternity leave, paternity leave, whatever the case might be, and your current income is lower than what your recent tax return showed or what you recently used to calculate an income-driven plan payment, you can submit to have that payment recalculated. You don't have to wait until your next recertification period. All right, everybody with student loans should be doing the following, right? So checking your studentaid.gov portal. So we did that when we grabbed our student aid data file. I showed you guys that there's that IDR end of payment term widget that is in there that you might see if you're using an income-driven plan. And then we want to also make sure our loan servicer account matches what we're seeing in our studentaid.gov portal and the data that we're seeing on the My Student Loans tool. Right. At this point, I mean, you had to do it every year. Right now, with all of the uncertainty and everything kind of restarting and still a lot of changes going on, I'd be doing this monthly, right? I know it sucks to have to look at your student loans that frequently, but you really want to make sure that there's not any mistakes being made, right? So I really think you should be doing this as frequently as you can. And then when you have some confidence that things are heading in a consistent direction, then maybe you can go back to less frequently than a monthly check. But especially if you're, dealing with a pretty decent balance of student loans, you want to keep a close eye on that, right? The bigger your balance, the bigger the mistakes are. So the bigger the impact anyway. Right? So you have to keep a closer eye on that if you have a hefty student loan balance. Check your forgiveness payment account data, right? So that IDR end of payment term, look for that module in your dashboard. If you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, you'll also see a public service loan forgiveness progress module in your studentaid.gov dashboard. The public service loan forgiveness count data does live in your file. So when you upload that to the My Student Loans tool, you'll see that payment count information. So I can show you that here. If I come back to the My Student Loans tool, now this particular person doesn't have any public service loan forgiveness time, But if you do, and you see something greater than 0 up here at the top, then this will give you a breakdown of your public service loan forgiveness qualifying time per loan. Right, so you can check that in your file, check that against what studentaid.gov is showing you, and then you may even want to check that against what your loan servicer is showing you. And if you're seeing different numbers in those places, particularly for public service loan forgiveness, that's a good indication that it's time to submit a public service loan forgiveness employment certification form. And so you can have that employment recertified or looked at again to make sure that those counts are as high as they should be. There's 2 different ways that you can get your IDR payment count data. Let's see if I'm still logged in. So now it logged me out. So the first is via the studentaid.gov portal. So I have to log back in there. Right, and you're going to look for this IDR end of payment term widget on your dashboard there. And here, one of the niftiest things, if you can see it, is this view IDR progress, right? So for a lot of you, this might be the first time that you're actually seeing your payment count data, right? We've been waiting for years for this, right? I mean, public service loan forgiveness really didn't start improving until they surfaced what your public service loan forgiveness eligible count was, right? And we've always been missing this. The way that we did this before is we had to request from our loan servicer, hey, what is the qualifying IDR forgiveness count you have for my loans? And holy cow, was it a grab bag of garbage that you would get back from them, right? So now we actually have data to look at. It may not be correct, right? But it's there. It's a starting point, right? And this is, to me, really encouraging. Right? We've been needing this data to get our loans across the forgiveness finish line. Right now, it sucks that we're finally getting to see it when one administration who was forgiveness hopeful is on their way out, and one that's a little bit more forgiveness aggressive against these plans is coming in. Right. So this is where you're going to want to do some record keeping, right? Grab some screenshots of what you're seeing in here, right? Payment history. If you don't agree with the data that you're seeing in here, or you're not sure what they've counted as qualifying and what's not qualifying, you can see that in your payment history, right? These ones that are marked for ineligible for me, this is because of the SAVE forbearance and the litigation against SAVE. There is a nifty little filter in here where you can filter the payments between qualifying and not qualifying, right? So you can see, hey, if I've got a whole bunch of non-qualifying payments and it's not clear why, then you can submit a complaint to student aid. You can submit a complaint to the federal student loan ombudsman. You may have to submit a complaint to your congressional representative, right? If you're not going to get any kind of response from those other organizations. Right, but this gives you some feedback mechanism, so you can start to see what did they count, what did they not count, does the count pass the smell test, right? And then ideally, you would grab this data, right? You would take this data, save it for yourself, just on the off chance. Again, coming back to Chris, I know Chris has asked a lot of questions in the past. I'm going to pick on him a little bit. Ask the first question about what do we do if studentaid.gov is down, right? You grab the data while you have access to it. Right, and at least you'll have some kind of historical record of what your payment count was if the data is no longer available in the future. Right now, this data is a little bit difficult to grab. Right, again, they did this on their way out the door. They didn't put a lot of functionality in here. Some of you are going to have, you can see my payment history. There's 296 payments. Right, that's a lot, and they're only showing 10 payments per page. So there's 30 pages on here, right? So scrolling through this and taking pages of, taking snapshots of 30 pages sucks, right? So this is one of the things I'm super excited to introduce tonight. We put our heads together. the VIN dev geeks who are amazing came up with a really elegant, creative solution to come in here and grab this data from this web page, provided that this widget is available to you. And it's a little bit complicated on how you're going to be able to install it and use it. And we're going to go through kind of an example of that at the end of this session, but I'm going to show it to you right now, right? Because if I, try to coach you all and how to install it and everything else, it'll pretty much just end this webinar right here and there, right? Because everybody's going to get kind of confused and we're going to just be playing tech support the rest of the night, right? So I'm going to be happy to do that at the end, but I'm going to show you here that we created essentially a browser extension, right? It's only going to work for Chrome, right? So if you've got Chrome issues or you got issues with the Google, you may just have to swallow them for the purposes of grabbing this particular data. But we created an extension that you can use on this page. And if you click it, let's see if it'll start working. I may have to refresh my page one more time here. Again, it's a little bit clunkily here just because we are trying to get this available so you could grab this data while it's still available. All right, so now it started. You can see it's actually paging through all of my payment history data and grabbing it. And when it's done going through all of the pages, it's going to allow me to save that data as a spreadsheet file, right? And that will allow you to have some access to this data, right? On the off chance that for some reason it is taken down, studentaid.gov goes away, or otherwise we just, don't have access to that particular data for very long, right? So you'll be able to save this as an Excel CSV file, or, you can put it in Google Sheets, whatever, but you can save that to your device and you'll have a record of that data preserved for you to, review at a later date, right? Presuming that we can use this data and get access to forgiveness later on down the road, right? So it's pretty crude, right? But it allows you to preserve that data, at least the data that they have it, the way they have it currently available on the studentaid.gov site. So at the end of the session, again, for those of you that have access, it's only going to work for those of you that can see this income-driven repayment end of payment term. I'll show you how you can install this extension and use it to grab that data. If you don't have access to the widget, right? So if you can't see this IDR end of payment term data in here, there is another way for you to grab summary information of that payment count data, and it's available via API. So this was kind of the first crack at this, right? So Department of Education was playing around with this API. I'm not really sure the genesis of it, but somebody on Reddit had posted it and made it available. And if you click on this link, and we can try to put the link in the chat, while you're logged in to your studentaid.gov account, it will also show you the payment count data it has on file for you. It doesn't give you the historical detail, what they counted as eligible or ineligible, but it does give you a high-level summary that, again, it's ugly looking, but that payment count data is baked in there. The same data that they're showing me here, essentially, is baked into this ugly looking file here, right? So those are places that you can go and grab data and preserve for your records and monitor it while you have access to it. And if it should go away, at least you have a historical record of that data. And then the student aid data file, we showed you how to grab that information. You want to do a good student loan physical exam, grab your student aid data file, upload it into the My Student Loans tool, look for that IDR eligibility, determine your IDR profile, look for your anniversary dates, the monthly payments, those sorts of things. All right. Okay, I see lots and lots of questions in here. Yeah, another great question that comes up a lot will switching to, in this case, old IBR, restart payments or reset my payment count, switching to a different income-driven plan never resets your payment count. Right, that's been one of those confusions that has been around since income-driven repayment has started. Switching plans does not reset your account. Right, now consolidation can, right, but just switching from one plan to another does not reset your account. All right, Becca, any other questions you're seeing that pertain to stuff that we've been covering so far? Here's a,
I was just gonna say a lot of the questions are things that you're going to get to about, analyzing if you need to make a switch. There were a lot of questions about recertification, so I've been trying to point people back towards the resources that you've listed out. There was a good question here that you might want to kind of dive into, just because it's one of our most upvoted. Is there a cutoff point in income per year where it makes more sense to pay off your debts as soon as possible versus using one of these forgiveness eligible repayment plans?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it has to do with all the things that we've been encouraging you to do here, right? It's going to depend upon what your forgiveness count is, right? So how close or how far you are from forgiveness, and what your student debt to income ratio is, right? So one of the metrics that I use repeatedly as a guideline, right, but it really depends on the specifics of your circumstance, is the debt to income ratio and the debt to income ratio of 1. Right, if your debt to income ratio is 1 or less, right, so your income is equal to or exceeds your student loan balance, right, and you have more than 10 years until you would reach forgiveness, then you're likely to pay the balance to 0 before you would reach any kind of forgiveness. Right, general guideline. Right, but it brings together all of those variables. Right, and with the forgiveness payment count adjustment, more people are closer to forgiveness than they ever have been. Right, so that really has thrown a bit of a wild card into repayment, and particularly the answer to that question. It really depends how far out you are from reaching forgiveness. Right, I'm 13 years away from hitting forgiveness. My wife is 13 years away from hitting forgiveness. Together, we have more than $400,000 of student loans. Right, for us to pay the balance to 0 before reaching forgiveness, that means we'd have to do that in a time period that is less than 13 years. Right, which means in our minimum monthly average payment would have to be, I don't know, I can calculate it exactly, but it's probably around $4,000, $4,200 a month. Right, our current payment using an income-driven plan is nowhere near there. Right, so using that as a gauge, it tells me we should not be trying to switch gears away from forgiveness. Right, in our case, we've got plenty of time to kind of see this new administration, where things are heading. What does forgiveness look like? Is it still possible? Right, does it make sense for us to switch gears? Right, because again, I'm not going to more than double our monthly student loan payment just to try to pay the balance to 0 when there's still a very good possibility that we're going to reach forgiveness. Right, so that's a really difficult question to answer. There's not a hard cutoff, but it uses a lot of those variables. Right, what is your forgiveness payment count now? Right, so how far away are you from forgiveness? What is your current debt to income ratio? Right, what income-driven plans are you eligible to use? Right, if you're in IDR profile 1, IDR profile 2, those are generally the more beneficial IDR profiles. which means it favors more forgiveness, right? Because you can reach forgiveness sooner and you'll pay less towards your student loans, right? And for answering questions like that, more specifically, that's where we use the student loan repayment simulator, right? So this person graduated in 20, we'll use this as an excuse to run through one of those examples, right? So I'm going to blow this up a little bit more. This person is graduated in 2017. I don't know specifically what their payment count is, but I'm going to guess that it's, 8 years or maybe 7 years. All right, so I'm going to send this over to the loan repayment simulator. We know that they're using the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan. Unfortunately, we don't yet automatically populate the years in repayment, right? But again, we can guess, right? And if you're looking at your forgiveness payment count now, you can enter what that data is for you. All right, so we've got 7 years in repayment for an income-driven repayment plan, right? Let's guesstimate their income at, let's, for this, sake of argument right now, say it's 140,000. Right, you can change that from year to year if you want. Better to put your recent adjusted gross income in here, right? Because that's what studentaid.gov will use. If you provide a tax return, they'll pull the adjusted gross income, the AGI, from that most recent tax return that you filed, right? So better to use that data in here if you have that available. Because most of us haven't filed a 2024 tax return yet, right? We're kind of in tax filing season. Pull out your 2023 tax return. Look at that AGI and put that in there, right? Because if you were to have to recertify now, that's probably what you would be using. Right? If you're married, you can answer those questions. If you have dependents, right, children or elderly folks who live in your house that you care for and provide assistance for, you can add them to your family size for student loan repayment. Right? If you're going to plan to have a family or add to your family in the future, you can add that here. If you are going to hit forgiveness, right, we can guesstimate what that tax might be. If you have a dedicated forgiveness savings plan, you can enter in how much you're earning as an average annual return on that forgiveness savings plan. Right, the poverty growth rate, this is what helps to adjust the poverty guidelines that are used to calculate your monthly payment calculation. And if you currently have some forgiveness savings, it'll enter that in and factor it in the forgiveness planning module that helps to calculate your remaining amount to save to reach your potential forgiveness target. All right, so those are what all the inputs are that you can use, all of the variables. Again, why it's so hard to answer that question that Michael asked, that, it really depends upon these specific factors, but we can run a simulation and see. And what we'll find in these simulations is that the higher our forgiveness payment counts are, the closer we are to forgiveness, the more it's going to favor remaining in an income-driven repayment plan that provides forgiveness, right? Because it increases the likelihood, particularly when our debt-to-income ratio in this case is greater than 1, right? It increases the probability that it's going to be significantly more cost beneficial to pay the minimum and reach forgiveness than to try to accelerate and pay the loan to zero faster. Right? And this is pretty obvious here. Right? There's a more than $200,000 difference by the time I get to the forgiveness planning module between trying to pay the balance to zero versus sticking with the forgiveness payment plan. Right? And given the uncertainty, right, until we know that forgiveness is not an option, I'm not going to voluntarily pay more than $200,000 more towards my student loans just to treat the uncertainty. Right? That's not going to make a lot of financial sense. Right? Now, if we get to a point where that is pretty clear, then maybe we'll have to do that. Right? But we're nowhere near there yet. Right. So, and to come back to answering the question, where's the break point? Where's the, how do we know when to change that decision? It's when these numbers are a heck of a lot closer to each other. right? So when I look at the simulator and I see a scenario where, you know, accelerating the payoff will cost me about the same as paying what my income requires me to pay and planning for a potential tax on forgiveness, that's when I might decide, well, it's probably not worth all of this income-driven repayment, forgiveness, uncertainty. I'll just go with the accelerated payoff and try to hit zero. But in this case, I'm nowhere near that, right? I mean, unless you have more than $200,000 to burn, you know, feel free, right? But this is pretty much why we're not going to switch gears on our loans, right? I mean, something similar here would have to happen. We would end up having to pay a couple $100,000 more to accelerate our payoff. And it's not quite certain enough to me that forgiveness or income-driven repayment is, you know, unlikely enough to make that leap. So that's how you can, you know, again, starts with a student aid data file, student loan physical exam, getting your forgiveness count, understanding your student debt to income ratio, filling in these variables, and then starting to compare the outputs to see. In this case, it's a no-brainer, right? No way in hell am I going to accelerate my student loan payoff and potentially pay a couple $100,000 more than I have to towards my student loans. There's just no reason to do that just yet. Right. But if we get to that point, you know, maybe someday down the road, we might have to make that decision. Right. Hopefully not, but we're not there yet.
Tony, there was another common question about those that had have an IDR application that's been pending for 6 or months more, and realistically, what's going on with that, and what should people expect?
Yeah, that's a good one. So let me back up to see if I can find the slide where I talk about that. What's probably happening there is your loans are actually in that processing / general forbearance. Where did I put that? I don't know if I can find that one just yet. But if you submitted your application, I'm presuming for SAVE, right? And here's the most likely scenario. You submitted an application to consolidate your loans under the one-time count adjustment and applied for SAVE during the consolidation. They consolidated your loans, but they never put your loans into SAVE. And in many cases, they may have put your loans into a standard consolidation plan, which probably has a, you know, scary monthly payment, right? But you're going to want to check in with your loan servicer and see what status are your loans actually in. Around the time that the court blocked SAVE, there was tons of confusion. And the loan servicer started doing some really weird things. And a lot of times it didn't make a lot of sense. They got more guidance from the Department of Education, but that came later, right? And it came in the form of this processing versus general forbearance, right? So they weren't able to calculate a SAVE payment for you if you chose SAVE around the time the court blocked it, but that should have put your loans into a processing forbearance that lasted no more than 2 months. And if you automatically weren't put into the general forbearance after that 2 months, then your loans might be in a standard plan, right? Or they might be in a general forbearance, right? It can be sometimes difficult to tell the difference between the two. So that's where we grab our student aid data file, we upload it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, and we start looking at the data, right? We start looking at how much unpaid interest do I have in here, right? If I consolidated my loans recently, I shouldn't have very much, right? I can see that my loans accrue, in this case, $1,500 a month of interest, right? How much unpaid interest do I have? Is it about $3,000? Right? Because that's what I would expect, because the processing forbearance, the interest does accrue, right? There's no payment due, right? But after that which is the case for many of you that are in that in process, your loans are kind of stuck in that in process status. Your loans stopped accruing interest. They were put into that general forbearance. They just didn't change the repayment plan, or they didn't tell you that. Right, so we can usually tell the difference based on what we're seeing in the student aid data file. Right, now you're welcome to call your loan servicer and ask them all that sort of thing too, but you may again, kind of get a grab bag of garbage in terms of reply, right? So you can sleuth this out yourself or with our help on the student debt message board area, right? And we'll upload your student aid data file, look at it in the My Student Loans tool, look at your unpaid interest. What has it been doing? Has it been growing? Have you had a payment due? All of those things are clues as to what status your loan is actually in. Right.
Thanks, Tony. And then there's a ton of
Yeah.
questions coming in just about the API. Would you be
Yeah.
able to pull up yours and just kind of show what are the highlights that you're looking for to understand what all of that ugly looking text means?
Yeah, so that this will drive you nuts, and Beck and I have been looking at this data until the widget was made available. Um, this is not laid out logically by any means, right? And it helps if you've consolidated your loans because then you only have two loans to look at, right? There's one loan here, there's another loan here, right? Now, where this data starts to not make a lot of sense is they tried to say which income-driven plans you're eligible for, right? And the Department of Education, studentaid.gov does a crap job of telling you which plans you're actually eligible for, which is one of the reasons why I really encourage you to use the income-driven repayment eligibility tab instead, right? Because this is not only often incorrect, but it doesn't do a very good job of telling you which plans you're eligible for, right? But in here, it's saying, hey, if you were to use ICR, here's your qualifying payment count, which happens to be a couple of months short of what my IBR payment count is, right? The 143, right? I was using save. My save number says 143, which is the same as my IBR number, which is helpful. It shows me my remaining payments, 157 for IBR, 157 for save, right? That's what I would expect. Now it logged me out again, right? But that's what my IDR widget also says, right? So I can confirm that that data actually aligns in my case, which is helpful, right? So you may see that, right, in that forgiveness payment count API if you don't have access to the widget, right? But if in absence of the widget, so here again, you'll see my forgiveness payment count, 157 remaining, right? 157 remaining, right? In the absence of that nice little widget on the studentaid.gov site, you have this, right? So if this is all you have, grab this, save this. Sometimes we'll ask you to post this to the student debt message board as well, so we can save that data. But this is what will help us fill in the loan repayment simulator to know how much qualifying forgiveness time you have. I do see a question I'll jump on to just because I'm kind of eyeballing the Q&A panel myself. Hi, Sophia. You asked in the simulator, how do we know what number to place in the annual income growth rate percent to make it most tailored to our scenarios? Same with the tax rate on forgiveness and the poverty growth rate. So great questions, right? So different answers for all of those, but we'll go through them one at a time. So the income information, the annual growth rate really depends on your circumstance, right? But it's also going to depend upon how you're paid, right? If you're paid on a pro-sal kind of thing or a production where you receive production bonuses, your annual income growth rate is probably going to be a little bit higher than it would be if you were paid on a flat salary basis, right? And if you think about why that is, pro-sal, production-based pay scales, right? You're paid based on what you produce. And chances are your practice is adjusting prices on some scale, maybe annually, maybe more frequently, maybe less frequently. But your income will largely track that, right? Price increases, your ability to produce more. You generally stand to earn a little bit more if you're really busy or you're providing some, high dollar service items at that particular practice, right? So generally speaking, when we see pro-sal production based scales, we're going to see probably a higher growth rate than if we're looking at salary only, right? Because if you're salary only, unless you have an established process at your practice where you're having your salary adjusted annually, which most people don't, right? Then it's on you to go into your boss's office once a year and say, hey, what do you think about a raise? Right. And, in those cases, we're generally seeing incomes grow slower. Right. So it really depends on your circumstances, but you can also look at, what does your W-2 show this year? What did it show last year? What did it show the year before? Right. You can kind of see how your income is changing over time. And if it's consistent, then put that number in here. Right. This is really just to get you started. And it's also to prevent you from putting a number in here and leaving it the same for the next 25 years. Right. That's not realistic either. Right. So we have to, we kind of start you off with, something that falls into a quote average scale. Right. But it really depends upon your circumstances. So the more you know about your income and the more history you have in terms of earnings, the better you're going to be able to put this in here to change these. Right. And this, again, this really just is to, like, maybe you think 3.5% is too high. Right. During the pandemic, that was probably too low. Right now, maybe it's a little too high. It really depends on where you are, how you're paid, what your practice specifics look like. Right, but this will automatically adjust these numbers so you don't have to go in here and adjust them all individually for the next 25 years either. Right, but you can do that. Right, if for instance, hey, next year I'm going to have a kid and I'm going to be on unpaid leave and my income's going to take a hit. Right, I can, interject and put a different number in there. Right, but the more time you spend with these, the more accurate your simulation will be. Right, but in absence of that, and and for ease of demonstrating how the tool works, right, we want to kind of get you started, fill these numbers in so we have something to work with. Hopefully that makes sense. So when we come down to, you asked about the poverty growth rate as well. So this data we largely update regularly, looking at a long-term view of inflation and how it changes over time. Right now, inflation is running, a little bit hotter than usual lately, but depending on how far back you go, it starts to normalize and look more like a 3% type scale or even less. Right. So that's kind of why we have it here. There's really not a lot of reason to change this. We pretty much update this for you, except when we have big swings like we did coming out of the pandemic when we were seeing inflation at 9% for a little while. Right. Then there was cause to bump this up a little bit because we didn't know exactly how long that would last or when it might taper out. Right. But you really don't have to worry about changing this too much. So I would leave that where it is. When it comes to the tax rate on forgiveness, this is largely, we have that set as the default. I still think that's probably likely to be an overestimate for people who experience forgiveness and have to pay tax on it. We really haven't seen that, right? So generally speaking, when any debt is canceled, it's treated as if you earned it as income by the IRS. And with the forgiveness count adjustment, we saw a lot of people receive student loan forgiveness specifically in the last couple of years. Hopefully, we'll still see some receive forgiveness this year because there's a tax exemption in place for anybody who receives student loan forgiveness specifically between 2021 and 2025, right? This is 2025. We're in the last year of that specific tax exemption, where anybody who receives student loan forgiveness during one of those special tax exempt years doesn't have to pay any federal income tax on their student loan forgiveness. So that's what I mean when I say we haven't really seen anybody have to pay tax on student loan forgiveness yet, right? But if for some reason, probably likely, that tax exemption is not extended and is sunset, expires, right, then anybody who receives student loan forgiveness in one of those non-tax exempt years, maybe 2026 and beyond, you're probably going to have to pay some kind of federal income tax on the amount that's forgiven. right? We have a 30% rate estimate in there now. The top marginal income tax rate is 37%, right? You're not going to pay any more than 37% on that if you live in a high income tax state, California, New Jersey, Illinois, right? You may want to add a little bit extra to this, right? So maybe you want to bump it up to 35 or 37 or something like that, just as an estimate. But another place you can check is when you file your taxes. We're in tax filing season this year. When you meet with your accountant or you use your accounting software to file your taxes, once you get through that, they're going to show you your marginal income tax rate, the top bracket that your income fell in, right? As well as your average tax rate that you paid, right? So you can use that average tax rate, you could use that marginal tax rate and put that in here to improve the accuracy of your student loan repayment simulations, or you can use the 30% default to get started with your simulation. Right. So either is fine. Those will change as tax rates change over time. The new administration is probably going to try to find a way to keep tax rates lower rather than higher. What that means down the road, who knows, right? So, but chances are we're likely to see taxes go down rather than up, right? So, that's how all of these things in the macro economy can impact what's going on with your student loan repayment plan as well. So I think those are the three inputs that you asked about. Hopefully that provides a little more context on how you can change those. Again, you really probably don't need to change that poverty growth rate very much. Tax rate, again, probably don't need to change it all that much unless you live in one of those higher income tax states. And then the forgiveness growth rate is really where you can have the most influence based on the knowledge of your specific scenario. All right. Any other questions that kind of fall into those categories that we were just talking about? Okay, so you know what? I'm going to fast forward to some of these other tough topic ones, right? And I could see that, based on the questions that are in the Q&A panel now, that they're, kind of pertain to some of these things like this. So, should you switch? So I see Lee asking here, am I supposed to move out of save into another plan? All right, so the save general forbearance is not a bad place to be right now. Right now, eventually you may have to move out of that, right? You'll probably be moved out of that, maybe automatically, if what the outgoing administration laid out as kind of the transition back into repayment comes to pass. Right now, what they laid out is something that sounds like a payment that was based on the repay schedule, which was the precursor to save. Right, I don't know that for sure exactly yet. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly how they're going to calculate that payment for folks that are currently in the save forbearance, but it sounds a lot like it's based off of what used to be repay. But that's why there's going to be a kind of a ramp up. The loan servicers are going to put some process in place in their system to calculate that payment, and then we'll get to see what that is. And then a couple of months after that determination would be when those payments would be due, right? But I imagine there'll be some time in between there to be like, well, how did you calculate this? What does this look like? It probably won't be as low as it was under save. Maybe it's going to look like what repay or the pay as you earn payment was, but it's a little bit too soon to tell. Either way, again, having your loans in a status with no interest accruing, no payment due, is not a bad place to be, right? It gives you an opportunity to boost your overall financial wellness, right? So people are, I think, really just looking for what should I be doing, right? Should I be making payments towards my student loan? Should I be switching? I mean, neither, right? If you're in the save general forbearance and you want to do something, then calculate what you think your student loan payment would be and put it into some kind of interest-bearing account, right? Open up a high yield savings, whatever, right? And put that amount in that account, right? So it kind of allows you to see what your budget would look like as if you did have a student loan payment, right? And then when we have some more certainty of what things look like, kind of like, these are very similar to the recommendations we made during the pandemic forbearance period. Instead of making payments when no payments were due, you can build a savings account that look like the amounts that you'd be paying towards your student loans. And then when you have some idea of when we're coming out of this uncertainty, then you can choose to maybe use that amount to put towards your student loans, or use it as a way to blunt the impact of the monthly payments that will be due towards your student loans going forward. Right. So, it doesn't, I know everybody's kind of itching to get into something that looks more normal, but we're just not there yet. Right. So it's hard for me to recommend that you leave the save general forbearance to trade that no payment, no interest scenario for a scenario where you have a monthly payment due and potentially have your loan balance growing if that payment isn't greater than the monthly interest accrued. Right. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, there are certain exceptions to that. Right. So if you're knocking on the door of public service loan forgiveness, where you're knocking on the door of receiving IDR forgiveness because your account says you've got 5 months left, right? That's a different story, right? You may want to look at a plan that can help you earn forgiveness credit or earn forgiveness, right? You can't receive forgiveness and you can't receive forgiveness credit currently in the save general forbearance. Right. So if you were to switch, what would that look like? Well, it depends on what options you're able to switch to. Right. That's where that IDR profile comes into play. Right. Upload your student aid data file into the My Student Loans tool, check the income driven repayment eligibility tab. Right. And look at what your options are. Right. In this case, the only option we don't have eligible to us is the new version of IBR. Right, so if I were to switch, it would have to either be to pay as you earn or the old version of IBR. Given that choice, I would choose pay as you earn. Right, much better than IBR 2009. If I didn't have access to pay as you earn, I'm probably not switching to IBR unless I absolutely have to, the old version anyway. Right, this to me is kind of that in case of emergency break glass. Right. I really don't want to go back to the old IBR until it's pretty clear that's my only option. And right now that's not clear. Right. So again, unless you're in one of these exception categories where you're really, really close to reaching forgiveness and you want to see if you can get across the finish line, then you probably should just stay put. Switching to pay as you earn, right? You can get forgiveness credit, but you can't receive forgiveness. Right. So a little bit of a catch-22 there. Again, it's hard for me to envision a scenario where I should take myself out of a no payment, no interest scenario and put myself in a payment greater than zero, interest accruing to receive forgiveness credit, but can't receive forgiveness. Right. If you're already in pay as you earn or ICR, fine, right? Stay there. Right. But there's probably not a good reason to switch out of the save general forbearance into one of these plans that requires you to make payments and your interest is accrued. ICR is a little bit different story. Right. If you're one of the forgiveness payment count folks who received a pretty significant amount of forgiveness credit for the one-time count adjustment from consolidating your loans. Right. So kind of coming back to that, I'm knocking on the door of forgiveness scenario, right? And your debt to income ratio is relatively low, right? The people that received a lot of forgiveness credit generally have lower debt to income ratios. Not always, but generally, right? And that tends to favor ICR. Right? You can still get a reasonable payment under ICR that would give you more credit for forgiveness. But the big hangup is you can't be granted forgiveness because ICR pay as you earn forgiveness is tied up in the save litigation. Right? You can get credit You just can't get forgiveness. All right, so again, that's where, until we get maybe a ruling, once the court kind of rules on these plans and those issues that are outstanding, right, that will help to force some of that certainty, right? But right now, it's just too unclear to say, yes, you should definitely switch out of SAVE into one of these other available plans. Right now, public service loan forgiveness kind of changes that calculation because theoretically, you can still earn public service loan forgiveness while using pay as you earn or ICR. So if you're close, or you see yourself moving away from that public service loan forgiveness qualifying employer, right, it may make sense for you to try to switch to one of those plans where you can still get that credit logged. Right, but if you're a public service lifer and your loans are in SAVE and you still got 5 years or plus until you get to public service loan forgiveness, then you can probably afford to stay in the SAVE general forbearance, even though you're not getting credit for that time. Right, because again, I don't know that it makes a lot of sense for me to trade a no payment and no interest accruing for a payment and interest accruing. Right, so if I've got a little bit of a runway to work with, some time before I would reach forgiveness, then I'm going to use this general forbearance for sure. What about IBR? So some pros and cons here, right? And I've already kind of touched on this, but IBR is a different beast, created differently by Congress, more explicit provisions listed in there that guarantee forgiveness, right? So unless Congress passes a new law that specifically alters or changes these existing laws, these are likely to continue in their current form. And you're likely to continue to have access to these. Now, folks, new borrowers, people who haven't entered repayment yet, may not have access to these newer plans, depending on what Congress decides to do, right? But chances are, at least still pretty good based on current reading of what's out there, that current borrowers are still going to have access to the IBR plans. So then it's a matter of which one are you eligible for, right? Are you eligible for the old one or for the new one? You may see this actually called IBR 2007 and the new one IBR 2010, right? So the Department of Education tends to designate these by when they were created by law. I prefer to designate them based on when they were first available to borrowers, right? But they're the same thing, right? So old IBR in this case, new IBR in this case, right? So it depends on which you're eligible for. That depends on when you first started borrowing. There's no unpaid interest subsidy for either of these income-driven plans, right? So I've seen the recommendation on the Department of Education website where they tell you essentially, if you're using SAVE and you're in the general forbearance, if your income is low enough where you can get a $0 payment, just switch, right? But that's really not great advice, right? Because if you have a $0 payment under one of these income-based repayment plans, unlike SAVE and unlike the SAVE general forbearance, you're going to continue to accrue interest. Right. This is part of the reason why there were so many changes to the income-driven plans in the first place. Everybody hated watching their loan balance grow. I'm seeing it again, right? We're seeing it again in the comments in the student debt and income signal form submissions and the message board posts. The people that have either been removed from repayment or just getting introduced to student loan repayment in a world without SAVE or Repay, which had unpaid interest subsidies, meaning that if your payment didn't cover the interest, some or all of the interest was covered by the Department of Education, by the government. That's probably going away, right? So if you switch to one of these other plans that don't have an unpaid interest subsidy, which any of the other plans that are currently available right now don't have an unpaid interest subsidy, payment is low enough, you're going to watch your loan grow, right? And that drives people crazy, right? That was one of the reasons why they created the plans that had the unpaid interest subsidies, because people were, losing it, watching their loan balance grow, right? And it makes it more difficult and to know what to do with your student loans, and also made people do a lot of things that didn't help by throwing additional money towards those student loans that didn't actually help to pay them down faster. So you end up in this cycle of, I'm paying more, my balance is higher, I don't see an end to repayment. Right? That's what the unpaid interest subsidies were designed to kind of treat. Right? So you don't necessarily want to run into one of these other plans out of the save forbearance specifically, because you may see that loan balance grow again. The income-driven plan, the IBR plans, the income-based repayment plans specifically, as well as pay-as-you-earn, have a partial financial hardship test. Right, so even if IBR is your destination or your last available option, unless you pass the partial financial hardship test, you can't get into it. And what is the partial financial hardship test? They look at what is your payment based on your income, your family size, compare that against what your payment would be under a standard 10-year plan. And if the standard 10-year plan payment is lower, then you don't pass the partial financial hardship test and you can't get into the income-based repayment plan. Right? So there are these tests, and that complicates things, particularly for the people who have high forgiveness payment counts, lower debt to income ratios. It can be very difficult to get into IBR, the old one, because you can't pass the partial financial hardship test, which leaves only ICR, which can't get you across the forgiveness finish line. Right? So you can hopefully kind of start to see why getting across the forgiveness finish line is so complicated recently, and just by virtue of switching plans alone is not necessarily the answer, right? So hopefully, as we get a little bit more clarity on some of this, it'll become easier to make those recommendations. The other side effect that IBR has is if you are in IBR and you have unpaid interest accruing, right? So your payment is less than the interest that accrues per month, the unpaid interest balance grows. If for some reason you were to leave IBR because maybe we get a favorable court ruling, or turns out, I'm going to use pay-as-you-earn to get across the finish line. If you leave IBR based on the law, they have to capitalize your unpaid interest, right? So they add that to the principal. The higher your principal, the more interest accrues, the more you pay, whether you reach forgiveness or not, right? So there's side effects to switching into IBR, maybe before it's warranted. So if you're in IBR now, stay there. If you will no longer pass the partial financial hardship test after you file your next tax return, you may consider switching, right? So there is a timing component here. We've actually seen a number of these on the student debt message boards recently, right? People who, for whatever reason, had a lower income last year or the year before, right? But once they file their tax return this year, they're looking at a scenario where they're probably not going to pass the partial financial hardship test, right? But they're pretty close to reaching forgiveness. That's a case where you may want to consider switching to IBR sooner rather than later. Right? Because if you can't get into IBR, then now you've potentially lost any forgiveness qualifying option, or an option that actually results in forgiveness once you pass the required number of payments. If you're close to or very close to reaching forgiveness and IBR can help you get there, then consider switching. If you're not using IBR, then consider waiting for more clarity before you apply. All right. Any switching questions that didn't fall into that category of
the biggest switching question is, what if they switch their country of residency, move to Canada, Europe? Will their student debt follow them?
Yes, it does. Unfortunately, yes. So you can't. There's nowhere on this planet that you can go where your student loans will not follow you. Right? Maybe if Elon can get us to Mars, maybe that changes. But your student loans will still need to be managed in some manner. Living overseas, however, does do some interesting things to the income on your US federal tax return. Right? So for those that live and work outside the US, your adjusted gross incomes on your US federal income tax return tend to be pretty low, if not zero. Right? And you can still use that as valid income documentation for your income driven plans, right? So you can have a $0 payment. However, right, when we're left with plans like IBR only, pay as you earn, ICR, when you have a $0 payment because you live and work overseas, right, your interest is going to grow. Your loan balance is going to grow. Right. So you will still have to plan for that potential tax on forgiveness, and that tax can be quite high because you're not making any payments towards your student loans and your interest balance is growing. Right. That's where Save and Repay were so helpful. Right. That didn't happen or happened to a lesser extent with Repay. Right. So you have to be very careful. Right. They will follow you and you can still manage them even using an income driven plan that results in forgiveness. But the numbers can get pretty big. Right, depending on what your student loan balance is and how long you live and work outside the US.
Questions have come up, and I think you've touched on it before, but just because I'm seeing these questions again, if you are, switching out of an income-based repayment option, maybe going to a non-forgiveness eligible, or even just changing between forgiveness eligible plans, what does that mean for your current progress towards forgiveness? Just because that's coming up again.
Yep. So changing repayment plans from one income driven plan to another does not change your forgiveness count. Forgiveness counts are preserved across the plans. Right now, if you use a non-income driven plan, right, you're no longer going to earn any forgiveness credit. Right. And that's one of the problems with choosing, or so the anxiety gets high enough, and I've seen this for years, right? People try the income driven plans for a variety of reasons. They're confusing, they're stressful, they don't like how they work, they don't see their loan balance decrease. They say, forget it, I can't take this, put me in a regular plan, right? Put me in an extended plan, put me in a 30-year plan, whatever, right? But those plans don't count towards forgiveness. They did under the one-time, keyword there, one-time forgiveness payment count, where they counted any repayment time as forgiveness eligible. We're not in that anymore, right? So leaving a forgiveness plan, right, particularly if you have quite a bit of forgiveness credit, is risky, right? Because you're no longer going to earn forgiveness credit. Right. So we take a lot of heat because we focus so much on these income driven plans. And that's fair. Right. But the income driven plans are crazy complicated. Right. And they're lately constantly changing. They require a lot of attention. Right. Time driven plans don't. Right. If you want to pay your balance to zero in 10 years, 20 years, that's an easy calculation. Right. What's your balance? What's your interest rate? We can put it in a calculator and it spits out a number. If you pay that number amount of months, your balance will be zero. Pretty easy, right? The not so easy part is how do you accommodate that if it no longer fits in your budget, right? And that's where life's surprises catch us off guard, right? You start families, you switch jobs, you move, whatever the case is, right? Your income drops inevitably for some reason, for some period of time, right? Now that time-driven plan is untenable. And if at that point you decide to switch into an income-driven plan, yes, you'll pick back up on the forgiveness credit, but all that time you spent in the non-income driven plan didn't count. Right. So that's why I generally am not a fan of using those non-income driven plans, even if you want to pay the balance to zero, even if you want to accelerate the payoff, do it using an income driven plan that provides you forgiveness credit. Right. Because then at least in case if you need the forgiveness credit, and some of us just never know when that's going to be the case, you've earned it, you've banked it, you have it, right? You'll hit forgiveness sooner rather than later. right? So it's not really about kind of an either or, it's about which ones provide the most flexibility. Right? So you're welcome to do whatever you want, right, with your loans, but I would really encourage you to do that within an income-driven plan that provides that forgiveness credit. Where are you now? What is your debt to income ratio? Right? If your debt to income ratio is less than 1, right, depending on how much forgiveness qualifying time you have, you're probably going to pay the balance to 0 before hitting forgiveness, but it's worth checking if there's a pathway to try to get you across the finish line. Right, and that's really what we've been covering a lot of here. If your debt to income ratio is greater than 2, you're likely going to hit forgiveness. Right? So you're going to want to choose the most beneficial plan that provides forgiveness, pay the minimum, plan for that potential tax down the road, and reassess that situation as your circumstances change. If you're in between, again, in my opinion, that favors an income-driven plan, because I want to have that forgiveness credit. Doesn't mean that I'm going to automatically reach forgiveness or even have to pay a tax. I can still pay the balance to 0, right? But I want to make sure that I'm banking that forgiveness time just in case I need it. Right. And there's still a really good chance, particularly if you're eligible for plans like Pay As You Earn, revised Pay As You Earn, the new version of IBR, whatever save looks like after the courts are done with it, right? They're 1.5 as a debt to income ratio still leads to forgiveness in almost all of those cases. Right. Maybe not for the old version of IBR, but for any of the newer plans, that's likely to be the case. Right. And you'll see that pan out in the loan repayment simulator. So if I were in the same general forbearance, I'd stay there for now. If I'm in pay, I'm going to continue making my minimum payments. I'm going to check my recertification date, my anniversary date. They're coming up, right? It may have already passed, right? Take a look at that. Same with IBR, right? Check those recertification dates. Stay put for now until you have a little bit more clarity. Public service loan forgiveness really depends. What plan are you currently using? What other plans are you eligible for? How close are you? What does your employment look like in the short and long term? So that one, I would encourage you to head over to the student debt message boards area, which is what I kind of want to demonstrate now. So I haven't done that yet. So let's do that quick as we're winding down, and then we'll do the demo on how to install the Chrome extension to grab that payment count data as well. And then we'll, take some questions on that as we're working through there. So when you're on the Student Debt Center, if you haven't already, it'll ask you to log into VIN. I'm already logged in, right? So it's got my profile here, but it also has a link to the Student Debt Message Board area, right? So it's going to ask me to log in. I'll provide my secondary security anyway, and it will take me to the Student Debt Message Board. Right, and this is where Dr. Mears and I patrol, right, and kind of borrowing from what makes VIN special, clinicians helping clinicians with complex clinical cases. We have a special little area dedicated to student loans where veterinarians and veterinary students can ask questions about their student loan circumstances and how best to approach repayment. And there are thousands of these posts in here, right, all from our colleagues. This is where all this information comes from and experience. Right, and you can browse those, read those. A lot of the questions in here right now are very similar to the questions being asked tonight. But if you want us to look at, what does this mean in the context of my student loans specifically, right, then this is where we do that. Right, so we have you fill out what we call a student debt and income signalment form. We move that over anonymously under your VIN or VIN Foundation account. You don't have to be an active VIN member to have access to this. If you're a veterinarian, we can get you access via VIN Foundation. You can still use the same username and password you have for VIN if you have it available. If not, we have a VIN Foundation application you can fill out to get a username and password that you can use to get access to this area. But it's going to have a lot of the specifics that we've been going through tonight: student debt information, interest rates on your student loans, what repayment option you're using, what your minimum monthly payment is, what is your income, right? Your marital status, right? This person's single, right? Recent adjusted gross income, right? Their primary concern, what should they do, right? How should they approach repayment, contributing towards retirement versus saving for the tax bond versus paying more towards their student loans, right? Those are very common questions, right? We go through here, do a good student loan physical exam using the tools on the Student Debt Center, right? Provide a reply, use the student loan repayment simulator when we need to, if we're at that point, right? Review the simulations that you provided, right? So then you can adjust those, answer those questions. You get the answers that you need, and the rest of the community gets to learn from that exchange as well. All right, so that's how the message boards work. If you have questions about that, reach out. There we have I have listed on here. I've been jumping around here a lot tonight. But there's a student debt help page, right, that kind of goes through that process for submitting a student debt and income signalment form or activating your VIN foundation access if you don't have an active VIN username and password. So there's links that you can use. We'll send out this presentation, as Becca said earlier, that has links to all that. And then you can also click through a lot of the questions that we didn't get through here tonight. But before I go over to the Chrome extension widget, what other questions, Becca, have you seen in here that might be ones that we should address before I do that?
Quite a few questions coming in recently about if you are on the save forbearance, does it make sense to continue making payments?
I wouldn't. Again, coming back to that recommendation I made earlier, instead of making those payments, I would put what you plan to pay into some high yield savings account. Let it earn some interest. You're not getting any credit for that. While there's no interest accruing, it can help to get you to the principal faster, but that also depends upon how much unpaid interest you have. Right? Any payments that are made towards federal student loans by law first have to go towards unpaid interest before they're able to hit the principal. So the example that I uploaded here previously would illustrate this concept wonderfully, right? Because they have quite a bit of unpaid interest, right? So this person, even though their loans are in pay, we can pretend that they're in save. They have $58,000 of unpaid interest on this account. Right now, they may, pretending that they were in save and not accruing any interest any further, they may say, oh, I'm going to make a $2,000 payment so I can get to the principal. That's not what's going to happen, right? The $2,000 payment that you make is actually going to go towards this unpaid interest balance first, right? And then once you pay that $58,000 off, then any payment that you make above what's required to be made would go towards the principal. Right. So this is the blessing and curse of the unpaid interest balance when it comes to income-driven repayment plans. Right. You don't get charged any interest on this interest. Right. It's not compounding. Right. One of the benefits of the federal student loans. Right. I make payments that are less than the interest that accrues. That interest accrues in this unpaid interest bucket. I don't get charged any additional interest on this interest unless it gets capitalized, added to my principal, right? But the curse is if I want to make additional payments, I have to first pay off this balance before I can get to the principal, right? Which then also increases the likelihood that somebody like this is going to hit forgiveness, which means you shouldn't be making any extra payments toward your student loans. Right. So I wouldn't. Right. I don't. Right. My loans are in the save forbearance. I'm not making any additional payments. I'm using this as an opportunity to boost my other areas of my financial wellness. My forgiveness tax fund is pretty much fully funded. Right. I have 13 years before I would hit forgiveness. I'm already at the level I would expect we would have to pay in taxes if we have to pay the taxes. Right. So I don't have to contribute anything more to that unless I just want that fund to grow. Right. And that's another reason why you might not want to pay towards your student loans, right? You can get a better return pretty much anywhere elsewhere right now than paying extra towards your student loans, right? Even with the no interest accruing. Right now, if you had zero unpaid interest, maybe, right? If you literally ran out of places to put your money, right? Then, and you're staring at surpluses in your budget every month. First, congratulations. Second, keep looking for other places to put your money. Third, if you can't find them, and maybe putting it towards your student loans to knock down the principal makes a little bit of sense, but it's not, in the top 100 places I'm looking. Right. So, be careful. Right. I really don't see a great reason to do that. Even during that forbearance period.
Couple of questions as well related to I'm especially seeing it for pay. So those that are using a plan that is forgiveness is blocked, but they can keep making forgiveness eligible payments using that plan. Can you sort of unpack that a little bit? I think it's confusing people that forgiveness is blocked, but they can still make payments.
Crazy confusing, right? So the forgiveness, you can make the payments, right? And the payments will count towards forgiveness. And you should see that reflected in your forgiveness payment counter, right? So if you're using an eligible plan like Pay as you Earn or IBR currently, or even ICR, you should see that IDR end of payment widget on your student aid website, right? So this is good because it's going to kind of segue into me showing you how to get this data using that Chrome extension. But okay, that is the code. I always wonder what the Department of Education thinks about how many times I log into this site. But I've got a text thread a mile long with all of these codes. But you should see this number decrease month to month if you're using one of those plans that is forgiveness credit eligible. However, when this says 0, right, when you've reached the end of your payment term and you're using a plan like Pay as you Earn or ICR, you're not going to be able to be granted forgiveness, at least right now, because that particular aspect of those plans is tied up in the litigation that involves SAVE. Right. So that's what would happen. So unless you're very close to reaching forgiveness, then you really don't have to worry about that. Right. You can still continue earning progress towards that end of payment term point using one of those non-SAVE income-driven repayment plans. Right. But once you get to the point where you've crossed the finish line, you've made the required 20 or 25 years of payments, you can request a forbearance where no payments are due and no interest accrues while you wait for them to determine or to process your forgiveness. Right. So those are your options if you're that close to reaching forgiveness, and you can get there using one of those forgiveness eligible plans, but not one of the plans that can actually grant you forgiveness right now. You're going to have to wait until the court actually issues a ruling on whether or not the Department of Ed has the authority to cancel those loans under those particular plans. All right, so let's dive in, or unless, Becca, you have any other ones that you want to throw into the question mix?
I think we can show that link there, just kind of reiterating that there's going to be a terms and agreement form to make sure that you're receiving the most up-to-date version of this Chrome extension. Just follow that link, fill that out, check the terms and conditions box, and then Tony's going to show you how to unpack that.
Cool. So here's the link to the page that Becca's talking about, right? So we just need you to put your name, email, check the box. It says, I agree to the terms here. Think of this as a little bit of a beta function. We're trying to get this in the web store. Hopefully that'll happen in the next couple of weeks, right? Which will make this a lot easier. right? But in the interest of all of the reporting that's going on, and even kind of coming back to the first question that Chris asked, what do we do if studentaid.gov is no longer available? This is kind of why we wanted to put this out sooner rather than later, right? So it's a little bit complicated, right? So you're going to go to this web form, fill out this information, and then you're going to get to a page that allows you to access a zip file, right? So for those of you that have never dived into the bowels of the browser to play with the extensions, normally you go to the Chrome Web Store and you can grab an extension, install it automatically, and let it do what it's going to do. Because our particular extension is still going through the Chrome Store evaluation process, we don't have a way for you to do that easily, but we can still have you install it into your browser to do what I showed you it did for my student loans, right? So you're going to download the zip file from the page on the student or from the VIN Foundation page, and then you're going to extract the zip file. So once you have your zip file available, right, it's going to look like one of those zipped files, right? And when you click on it, you're going to have the ability to extract it, right? So you're going to extract that file, and it's going to ask you, where do you want to extract it to? You choose a folder, it'll choose one for you, right? And you can use the one that it already chose for you, right? And it'll put all of the files that are in that zip file in that extracted folder, right? I already have mine extracted here, right? So here is where my extracted zip files live, right? So I'm going to come over here. So I've extracted that. Now I'm in my Chrome browser. I'm going to go up here. The extensions icon is this little puzzle piece, right? You should see that in your Chrome browser. Click on that. It'll show you any extensions that you already have, but I'm going to come down here to manage my extensions, right? I've already got this one installed, right? I'm going to remove it just to kind of demonstrate how to do this, right? I'm going to have to turn on the developer mode, right? So there's a little switch here in the top right corner. I'm going to click that. It's going to give me 3 more buttons, and I'm going to click this load unpacked, and it's going to then take me to the area that I downloaded or extracted my zip file, right? And I want to select that folder where that extraction resulted in, the location that it extracted to. And when I do that, it'll load that extension into your browser extensions, right? I know that sounds complicated. It's pretty easy once you grab the zip file and extract it, right? But here we can see it's installed, right? Now I can come back up here, and I like to pin it so I can see it in my toolbar up here, right? And then I come back over to the studentaid.gov. If I have access to this widget, I hit the view IDR progress. I'm going to click on the payment history, right? Because this has got the most detailed information. You want to grab the most detail you possibly can. Once I'm on this page, I'm going to try running it, see what happens. You know, for whatever reason, we'll have to work through this a little bit more, maybe for version 2 when it's available in the web store. When you get to this payment history tab, if you click on the extension that doesn't do anything, refresh the page once. All right, once I refresh the page and click on it again, it starts working, right? And you'll know it's working because you'll see it scrolling through your payment count pages. Right, and it'll take a little bit of time, depending on how long your payment history is, to get through all of these. Yeah, I saw it, Samantha, your question pop in, how do I extract on a Mac? Process should still be the same, right? So if you have the zip file saved to your Mac, when you click on it, it'll allow you to extract that file to your computer, save it, navigate to that folder later when you unpack that extension, and you can install it in that Chrome browser, even on a Mac. Here, once it's done scrolling through the payment history, it'll automatically pop up a window that says, hey, we've got your data in this common separated value file, spreadsheet file. What do you want to name it? Where do you want to save it? Right. So essentially it saves it for you there. And you'll have that data available to you. Right. So now you've got a full history of all your qualifying and maybe potentially unqualifying payments. Right. So if I refresh again, it'll go back to the top page, right? And it shows me those ineligible payments that I was showing you guys earlier. Right. Any other questions specifically on the extension and how to install it? We're going to put some instructions and things up on the website. This is kind of our, release, if you will, of that. We figured you guys are going to be a good test group for us to tell us what we've missed and, any issues that you're having making it work. But I'm hoping tomorrow morning or even later tonight, I'm going to see some confirmations from folks that have been able to successfully save their payment history data in their to their computer. Yeah, so Samantha, great question. So once you've downloaded, how do we add that extension again? So coming into the extensions in the Chrome browser, there's a little puzzle piece. Right, manage extensions all the way at the bottom. And then you're gonna, if you don't already have it turned on, there'll be a little switch in the upper right corner that says developer mode. You want that to be on. When you turn that on, that's where you'll see these options to unpack that extension. Right, and you click that load unpacked and then navigate to that folder, the result of what you extracted from that zip file. So Aaron, the one way that you could do this without the widget is via this payment count summary API, right? And I think this has probably been shared already in the channel, but I'll post it in there again just because I have it handy, right? But you have to be logged into studentaid.gov. And if you either don't have the widget or you can't make the extension work, then you can grab this API data, but this is only summary data, right? It doesn't contain the entire history. It just has the resulting qualifying payment count and how many payments you have left. Right, and it's really ugly looking, right? So if you have to use that, that's what you would want to use. But ideally, if you can get to the payment history, you want to grab a record of all of that payment history. The zip file for the widget is available on this page here. So this is the page that you have to fill out, right? Just your name, email, acknowledge that, yep, you're, abiding by the terms and conditions here, and that, this is kind of a beta level extension that you have to install on your own. It's only designed to work on that one particular page of the studentaid.gov website to grab your payment history only, right? So, but we also don't really know how it might interact with any other extensions that you might have installed and things like that, right? So that's why we just want you to, check that box and acknowledge that sort of thing. And, as soon as this is available through the web store, it'll be a lot easier to install. We'll be able to provide more support and updates for it more reliably and automatically. But again, in the interest of uncertainty, we wanted to give you a chance to download that data sooner rather than later. Oh, great. So Victoria said it worked for me after I reloaded the page and then clicked the blue button again. Excellent. Let's see, any other? Does the extension persist if we delete the folder that came from the zip file? Or does that have to stay on the computer? Once you extract it, I believe you can delete the zip file itself, right? But I probably wouldn't do that until after you confirm that the extension was unpacked and loaded into your browser and works, right? So you should be able to, right? Because once you once you extract the zip file remains, but the extracted files are the ones that the extension uses to put it into your browser. So you don't really need that zip file any longer. So yeah, you theoretically you can delete that zip file once you unpack it and confirm that it's there and working. Awesome, great. See some confirmations there. Once it is on the extension page, how do you proceed to use it? Right. So great, again, great question. What I like to do, right? So on my extension page, I see that it's here, it's activated, right? I go back to my little puzzle piece thing in the Chrome browser, the extensions, and it'll show me all of the extensions that I have activated, right? But there's this little pin, right? I click the pin for the download my IDR progress, which is the name of the VIN Foundation extension that we're talking about tonight. And I pin that to my browser bar and it sticks the little icon up here, right? Then once I'm on this payment page, right, I don't have to dig into my extensions to activate it. I can just click on it right here. Right, and once again, and if it doesn't work, if you click it and start and it doesn't do anything, right, hit the refresh button once and then come back up here and click the start.
I also just shared in the chat, but by completing that form, we'll also let you know once the extension is available in the Chrome store, as well as information on future updates.
Great, yeah, thank you. I see Miranda asks, is there any reason that the FSA site would be a few months behind? Like mine lists the most recent payment as October. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. I have to dig into your data a little bit more. The only other thing I can potentially guess is that you're possibly in that processing forbearance and it hasn't quite moved into the general forbearance or something like that. I mean, kind of a guess, but I that's a good question. I'm not really sure. Right. Yeah. And there are going to be a lot of questions like that, right? When you start looking at this, it's kind of like, wait a minute. Why did they count this? Why did they not count this? Why am I only seeing data up to October? You know, like I don't see any January data in mine yet, you know, so maybe there is a little bit of a lag, right? I really don't know, right? So we're gonna learn a lot as more people are in here playing with this and asking questions about it. All right, seeing some works, great. How do you figure out your one-time account adjustment if you aren't on save? Yeah, you don't necessarily have to be on save, but you probably have to be using one of the income-driven plans, right? From the feedback we've got from folks on the message boards, it appears that only folks that have been in an income-driven plan or are currently in an income-driven plan see this IDR end of payment term. So if you were one of those folks that consolidated your loans and maybe it ended up in a standard consolidation plan because you applied for save and it was blocked or something like that, you may not see this widget, right? In which case, that's where the API data is something that you can go grab, right? So you have some kind of record. But until or unless you were to get your loans into an income-driven plan, you probably won't see that that end of payment term widget. I wanted to, I don't know if Sarah's still here, but she has some questions about the public service loan forgiveness counts. They should stay. And again, you should see a public service loan forgiveness count widget in here too. If you have some public service loan forgiveness count, I would grab that data as well. We don't have a nifty little extension to do that yet, but we have the framework to be able to do it, right? So we've kind of demonstrated the proof of concept here. We could probably go in and grab that public service loan forgiveness data down the road, but we also don't need to, right? Because that public service loan forgiveness account data also lives in your student aid data file. So you can also grab a record of that using the student aid data file that's available through the view details link that we talked about earlier, right? So grab what you can, right? Especially when it comes to forgiveness counts. Make sure you just have a copy of that for your records. Where should we go to catch up after we have follow-up, or after this, we have follow-up questions? The message boards would be great, right? So if you have questions about what you're seeing, the more you post questions on the message boards, the more other VINers and other veterinarians and veterinary students see those questions on the message boards, the more questions will get, asked, and more people will see the answers to those questions. If you're really struggling, we can try to do it via email, and maybe even pop into a Zoom or something really quick to try to get that to work for you. But ideally, we would do that on the message board so the most people can get visibility on that and see how those things are going, and get answers to those questions and work through those issues that you might be having. Yeah, I see a question here. My student aid payment history says amount due 0 for all months, including all payments I made. Mine does too, except for the most recent ones, right? So again, this is not perfect, right? But it's there, and it's better there than not there at all, right? So I see the payments that were due for me under save prior to the court blocking it. But if I go far enough out, right, I don't see anything in there, right? And when I download my data for all my payments, it doesn't have all the actual amounts that I've paid. It does, however, show me which have been marked as qualifying versus not qualifying, which is super helpful. Right, Victoria picked up on a good one too. I ran, but some of the data is missing, right? So this is what I think maybe you're seeing, right? Some of this stuff, right? I wouldn't worry too much about that, right? So what that is if I click on these details, right, it's grabbing this data and throwing it into a spreadsheet column. And for the payments that are marked as ineligible, it is putting some of that funny spacing and characters that you're seeing in there, right? Those are things that we'll work on for kind of version 2 of this, but I wouldn't worry about that stuff so much. But it tends to be unique to the ineligible, the payments that are marked as ineligible. All right. Once I have downloaded the widget, can you go over how to draw out the data from the qualifying payments? Yep. So if you've got the widget and it's installed, you can see it in your extension there, right? And you're on the qualifying payment or the payment history page, right? I'm going to just click that button, hit the start button. And if it doesn't work, right here, I see that it didn't work there again. I'm going to refresh that page really quickly. Come up here, try it again, hit the start button, and then it started. Will we be notified with the outcome of the legislation regarding forgiveness of pay? What is the best way to stay up to date with this info? Absolutely. I mean, when that court provides that ruling, it's going to be pretty big news, right? And even if you miss it, right, we've been putting blog posts out on the VIN Foundation website, trying to do at least one monthly, right, to keep everybody up to date, right? The most recent one was January. We've got one from December. We've got one from November. There'll be another one for February. Once that court ruling is issued, we're going to put, a lot of information out about that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of information in the news about it, and there'll be a lot of people trying to make sense out of it. So it'll be tough to miss, right? But, if you're subscribed to receive VIN Foundation emails, if you're on the student debt message boards, if you're perusing or occasionally checking out the VIN Foundation blog area, you're going to see that information there. Okay, Crystal, I see you're having some issues with it. If I click on the name download, it just takes me back to the VIN site. Crystal, maybe we can work offline either via email or set up a Zoom or something to help you get that extension installed if you're having some issues there. Sorry about that. Anyone else not seeing any payment history? Yeah, if you're on your dashboard, right? So if you're studentaid.gov, the first page that you log into, if you don't see this widget over here, whoops, this one here, right? Then either you're not currently using an income-driven plan, or it's not available for you to see on the studentaid.gov website. Right, so not everybody can see this as far as we can tell right now. And it seems to be unique to people who are using income-driven plans. And the folks that aren't in an income-driven plan or are otherwise in a forbearance or not in a repayment status are not seeing this thing either. Okay, yep. For those of you that are not having luck with the extension, we'll do what we can to help you get that working in your browser. I don't think we'll be able to do that here in this format, but we'll try to get you the assistance to get that functioning. Yeah, so I see another great question here from Anonymous. I'm currently in the SAVE plan. I graduated in 2000. When I look at a possible IBR repayment, it gives me the option of IBR and a forgiveness date of now. Can that be correct? It can be, right? We have seen that scenario on the message boards, right? So if you have met the 25-year required payments to reach forgiveness and your loans are in SAVE, you won't be able to receive forgiveness while they're in SAVE. However, if you are able to switch into IBR, then you could theoretically receive forgiveness, right? Because you've crossed the threshold and you just now need to be in a plan that would grant you that forgiveness. But that can be complicated, right? Because IBR does have that partial financial hardship test. And if your debt to income ratio is less than 1, you may not pass that test, which means you won't be able to get that loan into IBR. You could get it into ICR, but you still wouldn't be able to receive forgiveness until the court rules and hopefully rules and says you can still receive forgiveness under a plan like that. Yeah, and if you can get it in 2025, you would be exempt from any federal income taxes on the forgiven amount. You shouldn't need to consolidate, right? If it's saying that you've already reached the required threshold, then you shouldn't need to consolidate anything. Right. Okay. We've got there are a ton of other questions in there. We're gonna, we've been going at this for a while. I think we're gonna call this the end of this particular session. We do, Zoom does a great job of keeping records of all the questions that have been asked, and we'll try to get to the ones that we didn't answer here, in some format. Either we'll reply directly to you, or we'll put those together in some kind of document where we can address some of those questions specifically. If they're more specific than we can handle in a format like this, then I would encourage you to reach out and fill out a student debt and income signal form so we can do that via the message boards. But thanks to all who attended this evening and this latest marathon in the collection of Climbing Mount Debt Marathon webinars. Thanks for all of the engagement and feedback that you guys provide. We learn a lot from helping you. I know you guys all learn a lot from these sessions too. So we'll keep doing these sorts of things and do our best to keep you up to speed on all of the goings on with student loans. Thank you, Rebecca, Jordan, Taylor, for helping to facilitate behind the scenes, and everybody that helps to put these these sessions on. So, again, keep
Thanks,
asking
Tony,
those.
for all the work you
Yeah.
do. I was gonna say there's been
keep-
lots of shout outs to you in the comments and the Q&A. I think you had a fan club going in the Q&A at one point,
Oh,
actually.
geez. Well, appreciate that. I mean, I feel like we didn't need the helmet as much as time went on tonight. So, but I'm sure we're gonna have cause to have it pull out again here soon. I mean, things are probably gonna get a little bit murkier before they get clearer in the coming weeks, but
Mhm.
do your best to stay on top of things and keep asking questions, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
And for those that are still hanging out with us, we will be sending that follow-up email in the next couple of days. It'll have everything Tony's talked about shown, the recording. So if you need to walk back through some of those unpacking and extension steps, you'll have that available as well. And so that'll be coming in the next couple of days from studentdebt@vinfoundation.org.
excellent. Well, thanks again, everyone, and have a good night.